Hey everyone, this is Dylan Moore with the Volitional Science Network, and I have Nima Mahjour back to talk a little bit more MMT. In fact, we had a pretty good, some pretty good feedback from the last MMT for Conservatives video that we did. In fact, it was so good, Nima got invited to Real Progressives to talk about his libertarian view of MMT. It was a great interview. I watched it. We'll link it below. You can go check it out. And this is one of the reasons why me and Nima have decided to put so much energy into making this, is that we really feel that this is something that needs to be talked about. And there's a lot of room here for both sides to understand what's going on, so we can come up to real solutions to the economy. And right now, there are no conservatives talking about this. And if we want to stay relevant, or we want to come up with real solutions, we got to start talking about this. So, Nima, it's great to have you back. Are you ready to go on to the next step on MMT for conservatives?
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
Awesome. And then just give us a quick thing, how you felt about your interview with real progressives.
I think we each represented, different political angles, but we had a common understanding of MMT, and so it was a very reasoned and well structured conversation, I'd say. And a lot of the feedback was actually, oh wow, this was actually one of the few adult left versus right conversations that I've seen. So
it was the only adult left versus right conversation I've ever seen.
Okay.
So this is the second video in a series that we're making for MMT for conservatives. So if this is the first video that you've seen, we actually recommend that you go back and watch the first one, because if not, this is going to sound pretty foreign to you. We're going to recap a few points that we went over in the previous video, but for the most part, we're going on into new territory. So again, if this really starts sounding foreign, absolutely bizarre, or totally leftist, go back and watch that one first. So that being said, let's talk about the idea of credit money. We spent some time looking into the statist origins of money, and actually dispelling the barter theory of money, the barter theory origins of money. And Nima, we were talking a little bit about this before. Give us an idea how money could have come into existence originally as credit.
Yeah, so the common belief in conservative and even mainstream economics, and also Austrian economics, libertarian circles, is that money came out of barter, when anthropological evidence shows that there has never really been any systems of barter on any large scale, or even on a small city scale. And the credit money theory has much more evidence supporting it. And it says that credit money began when people started exchanging goods and services, but it didn't happen in the way that barter theory suggests, where I have nails, you have shoes, we both trade things we like. It was more like, I have nails, I'll give you nails, and you give me a piece of paper that says Dylan owes the holder of this note something like nails, or something that's worth something like nails. It wasn't necessarily clearly specified, and there wasn't elaborate price systems back then, but that's how credit money originally emerged. And the state money theory is really just an extension or a subset of credit money, which is the state gives you a token that says, actually in some cases it used to be where you could actually buy basic necessities from the state, grain, barley, etc., in the Mesopotamian period. But nowadays it's really just, I'll give you this money and you can use it to extinguish your tax liability with me.
So that's an interesting concept. So if we're saying that credit money, that money originated as credit money, and it wasn't necessarily a government that started it, anybody can issue their own an IOU, right? The big question is who's going to accept it.
Correct. There have actually over the years, and Graeber writes about that in this book.
Debt, the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber.
So he describes there have actually been civilizations, for example, Islamic civilization, for quite a while had a credit money system that was not state money, but rather trustworthy merchants issuing money, and always guaranteeing it. At some point it was gold and other things in exchange for that token. However, for the sake of facilitating exchange, people didn't really ever need to demand the material goods for the token. They just used the token, and the fact that the issuer was trustworthy and that he could deliver was good enough. And for practical purposes, doesn't make sense to be carrying around a bunch of gold all the time,
or a bunch of nails,
or nails,
or shoes, or whatever.
But then there has been, over time, in the state money systems have emerged and have become very trustworthy systems, because the state, in areas where the state taxes, which is obviously everywhere, that is probably the most reliable entity to be issuing these kinds of tokens, because they can kick down your doors.
They get backed by force.
They're backed by force ultimately, yeah. So
yeah, so essentially
nothing safer than that in a way.
So essentially, the state can take a geographical area and make a stable currency in it by essentially demanding it as taxes. And as far as we've known throughout history, this is simply the most stable way to create a currency, right?
Correct. The state imposes a tax, and by virtue of that fact, the currency unit in which they demand the tax becomes valuable. So the state can then issue money to buy things that are for sale in that currency that they've declared, and people have a demand for that currency because everyone needs to pay their tax, or at least a significant, relevant number of people within that territory need to pay their taxes in that currency. So in any such system, we have the state as the issuer of the currency, and we have the private sector as the user of that currency. And then we have the foreign sector as the issuer and or user of a different currency. Because there's a different state, create a different currency, like, for example, United States and Canada. We have different governments that declare a tax in different currencies, and so we have different currency issuers. So from the standpoint of the US, you can divide the economy into three sectors. There's the public sector, which is the issuer. The private sector is the user of that currency, and the foreign sector, which is the issuer or user of a different currency. And for the private sector, as we know from historical evidence, the private sector always has a demand to net save the currency issued by the state over time, because they want to retire one day, they want to have a safety net in case something catastrophic occurs.
They want to buy a house.
They want to buy a house one day.
Yeah.
They can't create the currency, so they need to save the currency. So when the government spends money into existence, it hires people to, for example, build a bridge. Those people then receive that money, and they're in the private sector. So when the government spends money into existence, they inject what we call net private saving into the private sector. And when the government taxes money, they withdraw net private saving from the private sector. And as we've seen over time, whenever the private sector whenever the private sector net private saving declines or even goes negative, we are very close to a recession, or in most cases, actually even a depression. We've discussed on our previous call, there have been 7 periods of budget surpluses in the US, and all 7 periods have been followed by a pretty catastrophic depression. And the sectoral balances equation is important because there's one more way in which the private sector can obtain net private saving, and that is through the foreign sector. So if the country has a current account surplus, that means that more money is coming in from abroad than is leaving the country to go abroad.
And a foreign current account surplus, right? Not a surplus between itself and a foreign entity, not a surplus between the public sector and the private sector.
Correct.
Right. Just
Correct.
wanted to clear that up.
But it could be it could come from a foreign public or a foreign private entity. That doesn't matter for our own purposes inside our own country. That's why the foreign sector is the issuer or user of a foreign currency. But when someone from abroad wants to buy something from the US, let's say somebody in Spain wants to buy my guitar, then he will go to the US central bank and say, give me, I'll give you my euros, you give me US dollars, and then I can send those US dollars to Nima and he can send me the guitar. So in other words, the Fed creates, or the US government, the issuer of the US currency, creates money, and in exchange for that, it receives foreign currency reserves. And in the US, they use the Federal Reserve. And
is that the way it actually happens in practice? So if I'm the Spanish guy with the euros and I want your guitar and you need dollars, is the Federal Reserve or the US government actually the one that will take the euros and give me dollars? Or is there some other place that those dollars come from?
In last resort, yes, but there are intermediary dealers, obviously, who, so you don't actually go to the Fed. But in the end, those intermediary dealers, they will settle up and they may or may not get the money from ultimately the banks will probably deposit their foreign currency either on their own account at the Fed, or they exchange it at the Fed for US dollars or something like that.
Okay, but yeah, there's a foreign exchange and there's a lot of money flying around everywhere, and generally there's enough flying around that you can turn your euros into dollars.
That too.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's intermediary. But in the end, the money accumulates at the Fed. That's why you see, for example, the Bank of China accumulating US dollars for that exact reason. Because China has a current account surplus against the US.
And that segues perfectly into imports and exports, right? So let's talk about China, because it's pretty relevant. If China is selling goods to the United States, that means goods are entering the United States and money is leaving the United States and entering China. So there's a net drain on money from the United States to China in US dollars, correct?
Exactly. That's why the US has a current account deficit with the rest of the world. Because US dollars are leaving the country more than they're entering the country, or US dollars are leaving the country more than foreign currency is entering the country. And that leads us to a situation where in the sectoral balances equation, where we have a public sector, private sector, and a foreign sector, ultimately, no matter what happens, these three have to balance out to zero. So if we have a lot of US dollars leaving the country, that means the foreign sector is running a surplus and the US is running a current account deficit. So in order for the private sector in the US to be able to save, the public sector, actually, to be able to net save, the public sector needs to run a government budget deficit.
And then you stumbled there for a second between save and net save, and I just want to make sure that it's clear to understand. Save could mean just me saving while everybody else loses their savings. Net save means if you take the aggregate, the aggregate is going up in general, correct?
Yeah. Because the savings that I have in my bank account, they are not necessarily only the result of the Fed spending. The federal government spending. They're in most cases actually the result of banks making loans, because the majority of the money sloshing around in our economy is created by private banks, actually. But when a private bank makes a loan, they mark up the loan recipient's checking account. That constitutes cash savings, essentially. But they also book a loan on their books, indicating that that person owes them that money. So from that person's standpoint, it's a
it looks like savings.
It looks, but it's a net. It nets out to zero. There's no additional net saving. So when we say net private saving, we mean the private sector accumulating U.S. dollars that they can use to pay their taxes and save. Exactly.
So that was a lot. That was a lot of
the private domestic sector in aggregate. Yeah.
Right. And that was a lot of information right there. So essentially, because loans from a private bank have to be paid back, if $100,000 gets extended as a loan and then $100,000 liability gets put on the bank books, as you pay that back, it actually cancels itself out. Whereas when the government spends the money into existence, as long as it doesn't tax it back, that's money that doesn't need to be paid back. That's just floating out there. And so that number is what's representative of the net private sector savings. Correct.
Exactly.
I mean, until we take the foreign sector into account.
Exactly.
And so with the foreign sector, particularly in the United States, because we're mostly an export country, mostly import country, that means goods are coming in and money is going out. So on the international scale, we kind of leak money.
Yeah.
And so if there isn't more government spending to either make up for that, or if there isn't a way to say, hey, you know what? We need to be exporting stuff so the money comes into us, the net private sector savings is going to go down and people aren't going to be able to save, and people in aggregate, there won't be enough money to save and pay taxes. And historically speaking, once that occurs, it's just a matter of time before the crash happens.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. So, for example, you have a country like the U.S. that, because of its current account deficit, meaning dollars leaving the country, cannot afford to run a balanced budget without suffering a major depression of some kind or a major recession. Whereas you have countries like Germany, which run a chronic export surplus, a current account surplus, so they can actually afford to run balanced budgets.
And then real quick, I want to hit on that word balanced budget and just remind everybody, even if you've seen the previous video when we went over this, that to the federal government, the words budget, surplus, surplus, debt, balanced budget, and deficit have completely opposite meanings to you and I. To you and I, deficit means I've spent more money than I've earned. Surplus means I've earned more money than I've spent. And if I balance my budget, that means, I'm not in debt anymore. Whereas with the federal government, a surplus means they've taxed more than they've spent, so there's less money out there. A deficit means they've spent more than they've taxed, which means there's more money out there. And the amount of debt, ironically enough, is the amount of money available, right?
The amount of debt is whatever money was turned into bonds, basically. Whatever net savings they've injected that people choose to turn into interest-paying instruments.
Okay, that went one more step complicated than I thought. But essentially, that debt is, in some essence, money that exists out for the private sector, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I just wanted to hammer that in again because it took me a while to
There's
get
actually
the opposite meanings of the words.
there's some debt that's actually held by the Federal Reserve Bank, which, for the sake of this calculation, literally should not count as public debt. We still count it as that, but it really
It's
shouldn't.
not money that's out doing anything.
Right. Just it's money, it's bonds that are on the Fed's account, and the Fed is earning interest, and the Fed sends 99% of their profits back to the Treasury at the end of the year.
Right. So it's just,
it's not even a drain on the government's budget in terms of interest payments.
okay. So making sure that we understand this foreign account. So you brought up Germany. So Germany, as a net exporter, increases its money supply through the exports, particularly with euros, and other countries have euros too.
Net private saving.
Yeah, thank you. Net private savings increases its net private savings through exports, which is why it could run a balanced budget. And we've spoken about this in a previous video. Unlike something like Greece, where it's a net importer, and if it runs a balanced budget, it's going to run out of net private savings. And so that's something that's really important to take into account when a government's making budgetary decisions. Is money leaking in, or is money leaking out, or is money coming in due to imports or exports? Right.
Exactly. In Europe, you have countries like Greece and Spain and Italy, I think, and Portugal, which have a current account deficit, which means euros are leaving their countries and accumulating in Germany. So their governments would need to make up for that by running government budget deficits in order to avoid a depression or recession. And that is not really possible in the way that the EU is set up, because there are some statutory rules or some regulatory rules that prevent these countries from actually deciding their own budgets.
So yeah, the European Central Bank, or I guess I should say the EU in general, has forced these countries to give up their sovereign ability to make money, or to issue money, right?
Yeah, to make budget decisions and issue money with that. Exactly. Because there's 3% limit on the budget deficit that they can run.
Which is, if you do the math, absolutely crazy, but I don't want to focus on that one right now in this video. I think that's perfect transition into, tell us about what a floating currency system means. If we're just printing all this money everywhere and we can just create it out of nothing, it's a floating system, right? Well, tell us a little bit more about what that means.
Floating is as opposed to fixed. So a floating money system is one where the government doesn't particularly care about the foreign exchange rate of their currency. So I'm the US government, I issue US dollars, but I don't make any commitments to pay out some other currency at some fixed rate. As opposed to fixed money system is one, for example, I believe China has that, where they guarantee, or they have some kind of range within which they guarantee. So that means that the government has to have reserves of some other currency or commodity on hand to be able,
can't generate them, that they don't generate by themselves, right?
Exactly. So the gold standard, for example, is another example of a fixed currency system, if you will. It's basically a system that works in the same way that we just described. The government issues currency, private sector, foreign sector, blah, blah, blah. But the government also, for whatever reason, promises to deliver a certain commodity or some foreign currency at a fixed price. So I like to call a fixed currency system a floating currency system, where the government fixes the price or value of certain currencies and commodities through intervention.
Now, hold on. What I understand from my libertarian knowledge, or even anarchist or conservative knowledge of how the economy works, isn't that a good thing just to strap the government down? Because we don't want the government to have too much power. We want to be able to not let it spend itself out of control, right? Because I mean, there is a real inflation is a real thing. We talked about a little bit what may or may not cause it in the previous video, but isn't a fixed system actually a check on government power?
I mean, it's really not for number one. Even under gold standard systems, the governments have always been the issuer of currency, and they were able to issue however much they want. Only that at one point people started demanding gold or foreign currency in exchange, at which point they would usually just exit that agreement and make a new agreement. So also another problem with a rule like this is it's pretty arbitrary to say, okay, I'm going to pay gold at this and that rate. So we're going to start a government currency system, and I'm going to guarantee that the gold price will always be this
$36 an ounce. I think that's what it was.
It's really just a fiat money system where the government fixes the price of a certain commodity.
Well, and I think a really important
decision more than anything.
Yeah, and I think the important point that you brought up in terms of the arbitrariness is if we say, okay, gold is exchangeable, or money is exchangeable for gold from the government. If too many people do it, the government will just be like, change their minds.
Yeah.
No, just kidding. Or, and I've heard Warren Mosler point this out, whenever the government goes to war, I mean, it's not the case anymore because we're off gold standard completely. But in the past, whenever the government went to war, they would either turn off the gold standard or dilute it. Right? Where the ratio used to be like, okay, you need $1 of gold for every $10 of money that exists. Well, we're just going to change it to 1 to 30 or 1 to 50 or 1 to 100.
Right. So then it's like, okay, exactly when the gold standard's supposed to be helpful, preventing the government from doing bad programs or large unwanted programs, is when they suspend it. So then what's the point?
Yeah. And if and I want to look at inflation again, because the second thing is, well, what's to stop the government from overinflating? And we spoke about this in the previous video, is that inflation can't, I mean, and particularly hyperinflation, that's the one that everyone likes to jump up and down about. Inflation can't really occur until the demand for the currency has been met, right?
Exactly. So as long as there's unused capacity, which currently in the US we have about 70% capacity utilization.
Industrial capacity, right?
Industrial capacity, yeah.
And sorry to interrupt, can you give a brief definition of what that means?
I believe it's factories that are unused and things like that, but I don't know exactly what it means. But it's a figure that the Federal Reserve reports on. And so long as we have unused capacity, there's no real risk of inflation.
And unemployment, right?
What was it?
And unemployment. As long as we have unused capacity and unemployment.
Well, yeah. Well, yeah. Actually, unemployment is
you meant both of it by the one. Got it.
Yeah. Unemployment is basically underutilized capacity. So unemployment means, by definition, it's someone who wants a job. Who wants dollars and currently can't get any. So there's someone who's willing to do work and accept dollars for the work. So there's demand for the dollars,
but there's not enough dollars to give him the job. Right. So and of course, sorry, I interrupt you. Of course, it's more complicated than this because regulations might be the thing getting in his way.
That as well, yeah. But we definitely have a lot of underutilized capacity, industrial capacity on top of unemployment. So as long as that's the case, as long as we're not at full employment, and even the official unemployment numbers are not very credible. I mean, they're like 4% right now, but but real unemployment is actually higher. At one point in the past, we used to consider 10% or more unemployment a depression.
Right.
Nowadays, it's just, apparently that's just standard. And there are certain interest groups who want an unused labor pool for certain reasons that I can't really get into right now. But yeah. So as long as there's no underutilized capacity, there's no real risk of any significant inflation emerging from injecting net private savings into the economy.
Well, and I think we start to answer the question of, is it better or worse to give the government this constraint, even if we leave out the fact that it's arbitrary enough that they'll just switch it to whenever they feel like it. If we give the government this constraint of, let's say, gold, or even what's very common and in other countries is a tie to foreign currency like Zimbabwe or the Weimar Republic, where if the government is limited from creating enough money to fill its own capacity and to fill its own employment, that's a disservice to everybody.
And to let people pay the tax that they have imposed, most importantly.
Right. So there's got to be enough money to pay your taxes. There's got to be enough money to utilize full productive capacity. And there's got to be enough money that everyone can save the amount that they want to save. Right. Until that's hit, you're not really going to see any inflation.
Correct.
Okay. So if there is no inflation, and let's be clear, we're not saying that there is no inflation. We're saying that the cause and effect relationship of government spending is not generally what the libertarians say. Generally, the libertarian argument is if you put in $1 more, there's an exact mathematical equation where it's like things are going to instantly adjust, like, and the dollar is going to lose that much more value in relationship to
the quantity theory of money.
Yeah. So, if the government has this floating ability, this unbound ability to print money, why do we have bonds? Why do we need to fund the government with bonds if they can just print stuff?
We don't actually, but we used to, like under the gold standard, for example, the government had to deliver gold for cash currency, but they could discourage people from demanding delivery by giving them a bond in exchange for the cash currency that pays some sort of interest down the road. So that was a arbitrary restriction that created this arbitrary requirement to issue bonds. But in a floating money system.
Can I stop you right there? Just want to make sure I understood what you said and everyone else understood what you said. Is if we have a fixed system where I can exchange cash for gold and the government wants to discourage me from doing that, it can offer me bonds where I could put my cash instead to get interest, because I say, okay, I want some interest. So instead of getting the gold, I'm going to get the bonds. Did I get that right?
Exactly. 100% correct. And in today's world, there is really, it's a very valid question to ask. Why do we need government bonds? The system that we've described of the government issuing money and people paying their taxes in it, etc., could function just as well without any bonds at all. So the only reason why bonds are issued is to give people the ability to put some of their cash in interest-bearing assets. It's really just
guaranteed interest-bearing assets, right?
Yes. Yeah.
No risk.
Safe interest-paying assets. As Steve said on my call with Real Progressives, it could be considered like a basic income for the rich.
Right, because it right now, if it's sitting at 1% or whatever it is, and unless I got $1 million or $1 billion in there, 1% is not going to pay me anything. But if I do have $1 million or $1 billion, that's a pretty good return.
You don't need to do anything, yeah. So, I mean, that's Actually, interest rates have now moved up a little bit. On the short end, we're at like 1.7. On the long end, we're at like 2.9 or close to 3. So
I mean, still for
yeah,
like until you're in the millions, if
right.
you're not talking 8%, like forget it.
Right. Right. So it is really like it's a subsidy to the rich. It's a basic income for the rich, whatever you want to call it. That's really the true reason why we have bonds now.
Okay, because what I learned from G. Edward Griffin, literally from reading The Creature from Jekyll Island, is that interest rates determine the health of an economy. As interest rates go up, what that's signaling to everybody is that we're running out of money and we'll pay you more money in the future. We don't care about the fact that it'll never add up in the end. We'll just sell that off to our grandchildren because we're greedy politicians now and we don't care. We need the money now, so we'll raise the interest rate. And if we're doing okay and we don't need so much money, we let the interest rate go down because we don't need it so badly.
Yeah, but as we know, I mean, that doesn't make sense because the government never needs any money.
So right.
They like Warren Mosler said, the government never has
or doesn't have money.
Doesn't have any money.
So I don't think we necessarily have the answer to this. Why would interest rates go up or down? Why would the Fed decide one way or the other if it just doesn't matter?
Yeah, the Fed believes in the quantity theory of money. The Fed thinks that they can steer or guide the economy and limit inflation by raising rates and fight deflation by dropping rates, when there's actually no evidence for this belief. This is like
let's repeat that, because that was a pretty big slap in the face of the Fed. Like the one thing that you guys do, you don't know what you're doing with it. That's essentially what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
Like the one thing that you exist for, to control interest rates, you don't understand how that works.
There's even, Warren Mosler's pointed this out, there's even research that suggests that raising rates could cause inflation rather than dropping rates, because raising rates, if you have a lot of people who are holding bonds, they're going to make more money.
It's going to pay more money out in interest, right?
Yeah. People. So you were saying we have 1% now, where it doesn't really make sense for someone to put money in unless it's like in the millions. But what if the rate is 20%? Then a lot of people,
all the money would go there.
A lot of people put their money there, and they would be earning a basic income for doing nothing. That could cause inflation too. So it's not even really clear that interest rate policy has anything, if it has much, if anything at all, to do with the rates that the Fed applies. Now, the fact of the matter is they believe that is the case, right? So this is why market strategists and analysts take inflation into account when they estimate, okay, where bond yield's going to be, where short-term, long-term bonds going to be, what's going to happen to bond prices, etc. That's why they have to take inflation into account, because the Fed believes that they can fight inflation by raising rates and fight deflation by lowering rates.
Okay, so then explain quantitative easing.
Yeah.
And before I say that, let's just talk about where we generally get our information. So, my first opening or what the hell is the word I want? See, I forget words. Exposure. My first exposure to quantitative easing was watching Alex Jones's The Fall of the Republic, where essentially it was gone over that during the 2008 crash, all these toxic loans had been created, particularly through the mortgage markets, to people who couldn't pay them back, and they were just funneled into they're not checking anybody's documents. They're giving them to illegals. Anyone who could breathe is getting loans, which is driving up the real estate market. And because they're subprime, the instant that the interest rates change and they can't pay it anymore, the whole thing collapses. And meanwhile, Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan shorted it. They're selling these bonds at the same time that they're betting that they're going to fail. Which, I mean, even with MMT knowledge, it sounds pretty criminal to me. But Then the government turns around and says, okay, all those toxic assets that you created, instead of having us let you be liable for them and just die for the evil deeds that you did, we're going to let you, we will pay you for those toxic assets. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I mean, that's not quantitative easing per se. That was the bailouts of the banker bailouts, which is a bit of a different topic. I mean,
so somehow I got those two mixed up. Can you straighten me out?
Quantitative easing just means that the Federal Reserve buys really high grade bonds, usually government bonds, from the banks. Now, what you're talking about is, we're going to take your toxic assets and we're going to bail you out, basically. So that's what happened with AIG, I believe, where AIG was literally just acquired by the Federal Reserve. And a lot of banks got bailed out I'm not privy to the details of these banker bailouts. There have been programs like the Troubled Asset Relief Program, where banks could get rid of some of their bad assets and for a while, and get some cash injections from the Fed. But I don't know to what extent they literally just bought up all their bad assets, because if you recall, a lot of banks actually did pretty poorly. A lot of banks,
right? I mean, I remember
stocks
even driving around now, I see banks, and I'm like, oh yeah, that used to be Washington Mutual, and now it's Chase.
Right, and the Citibank stock crashed down to $1. I mean, shareholders got shafted. It's not like they didn't suffer any consequence from what they did, but the management team and stuff like that is different topic.
Right. So now, if the banker bailouts aren't necessarily connected to the quantitative easing, you mentioned that quantitative easing is when the Fed buys bonds from the banks. Where do the banks get these bonds, and why are they buying them?
But it's generally just very high grade bonds that are used.
What's a high grade bond? Something that pays a high interest rate?
Like a government bond, a very safe bond, not a troubled asset kind of bond that has gone sour.
Okay, so if I'm the Federal Reserve and you're a bank and you've got U.S. Treasury bonds that you've acquired because that's part of the bank's portfolio, and I go and buy them, what that means is I'm taking your Federal Treasury bonds and giving you cash.
Exactly. So basically, anyone who's holding bonds has a savings account at the Fed, if you will. Government bonds are kind of like a CD, a certificate of deposit that you're holding with the government. And if the government buys let's say you have a 30-year bond at the Fed, and the government tells you, or the Fed says, okay, we're going to buy that, we're going to commit a certain amount of money to buying bonds. That's what they do. That's how quantitative easing works. They say, we're going to buy 100 billion over the next 10 days.
Quarter, yeah.
Whatever. And then all that means is that there's another buyers added to the bond market, and they're going to buy my bonds and give me cash in return. Now, as a bondholder, I was holding bonds because I had them in my savings. So now I got a nice price for my bonds, maybe because they bid them up a little bit. But so what? What am I going to do with the cash that I'm holding? A lot of people suggest that you're going to just keep saving, or we're going to put it in the next bond. A lot of people say quantitative easing, or said back then quantitative easing was going to create hyperinflation, but it didn't, because it was really just swapping out different savings assets.
So let me again try to break that down. So I'm the Federal Reserve, you're the bank. You have bonds that you bought previously, government bonds, US federal government bonds, and I come around and I say, hey, I'll give you a premium on those bonds, more than they're paying out now, little one. So you're incentivized to buy them. I give you cash, which I can create out of nothing. I give you the cash for those bonds, And then you, instead of throwing it out in the streets and causing inflation, you just keep saving it and reinvesting it. That's why it doesn't cause the inflation that everyone's talking about, right?
Exactly. It's
go ahead.
There's no reason why quantitative easing should cause any inflation.
So, I mean, going back to what we've said so far in this video, it would actually be kind of nice if they did throw the money out into they're not going to throw it out in the street, spend it, do something with it, because that would help ease the demand of the US dollars, right?
Yes.
Could I logically make that argument?
Oh, can you elaborate on the argument? Sorry.
So if you're the bank and you got a zillion dollars tied up in bonds because you're a greedy banker and you want to hoard all the money, and I come and I say, okay, we have a conspiracy theory where I'm going to give you privilege and create money out of thin air that's going to cost the taxpayers money, and I give it to you in exchange for these bonds because we're in the same fraternal secret order, and you take that money. If you went and turned around and spent it instead of saving it and like buying new bonds and stuff, wouldn't that actually get more money to be liquid and kind of, I guess it doesn't change the private net sector savings, but wouldn't that like get it out to more people who could use it? Am I not making any sense?
But I'm a bank, so banks don't spend money by definition. I mean, you could say they've got. Is it going to make them make more loans or something like that?
I see.
But it's not. I mean, this goes back to how banking works, right? Because banks make loans not because they have more reserves on hand, which is another Austrian economics fallacy, the money multiplier. Banks make loans because they have a willing and able borrower, and
then they go and find the reserves.
And they have a willing and able borrower. They will make the loan. They will mark up the checking account. And if, for whatever regulatory reasons, they need bank reserves, they will find them later on. But there's no loan officer at any bank who has a screen somewhere that tells them, here's how much reserves we have. Here's how much you're allowed to loan. That's not how banks work. This goes back to understanding how banking actually works. A bank is an accredited lending agent of the society, of the state. They can create money out of nothing to allocate it, hopefully, to projects that improve the capital development of the economy. So the bank has the incentive to do that because they can make a profit on the loan from the interest they make. And they have an incentive not to screw it up, because if they do, they're on the hook to the Fed.
For the missing money.
Yeah, the Fed, the government might dissolve them, and FDIC would take care of that in the end. No bank wants that. So either way you spin it, doing this kind of stuff wouldn't affect the bank's lending behavior in any way. So
let's bring this back to quantitative easing. So what does the quantitative easing do then? And if it doesn't do anything, why do we do it? Why does the Fed do it? Fraternal secret orders?
Well, number one, they think they supposedly they think that it can stimulate the economy in some manner, like what you just said. The banks have more reserves, so they'll lend more. That was one of the thinkings that they had back in the day when they did the banker bailouts. But what the real reasons are, I mean, it is, in a way, it is a little gift to current bondholders. Say, I'm going to give you a slightly higher price. I don't know if it's huge or if there's some huge conspiracy behind it or whatever. It's not necessarily any big profit that you can reap from that, I think.
So would you say that it's largely a bad move sourced from economic illiteracy?
Well, I mean, yeah.
On account of the Fed.
The reasons cited, they're based on bad economic theory. But ultimately, if we go back to what we said earlier, there shouldn't really be any bonds. So as far as I'm concerned, they could just... they could just say, we're just going to buy up all the bonds that are out there and replace them with bank reserves and never issue any bonds.
Cash. Bank reserves meaning cash, right?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And then that will be it. And then never issue any bonds down the road, not pay a subsidy to the rich anymore. That's conceivable. They could do that. But
and who cares too, right?
Yeah.
It's not like you would jolt anything serious in the economy, right?
But if they wanted, even let's just say, because they also argued they want to use QE to lower interest rates, which is ultimately it's a good thing for mortgage lending and stuff like that, where interest rates are lower because there's no more subsidy to the rich, because the risk-free rate goes down. That would mean that all the other rates would also go down.
And couldn't you even say that the rich would then want to, the rich, we're using this blanket, rich people, I guess anyone who uses, that has a lot of cash and can make enough money throwing their cash into bonds. If the safety net of the bond no longer exists, they're going to have to do something else with that cash if they want to keep making money on their money, right?
Yeah, it could certainly spur private sector lending. That's possible, because the rates are going to be lower, mortgage rates are going to be lower, etc. But if they wanted to do something meaningful with QE, then the proper policy, just from the standpoint of their objectives, would have to be not, this is how much we're going to spend over the next quarter. That's very stupid, because now everyone knows how much you're going to spend. They would have to say, we want to achieve the following rate, and we're going to spend whatever is necessary to achieve that rate, to get to that rate. But they don't do anything like that.
Well, that was a lot of information.
Yeah, so QE is pretty much meaningless.
QE is pretty. Yeah, I think that's a good thing to take home. That conservatives, libertarians, anarchists, we can all shut up about QE. Would you stamp that message with your approval?
I think so.
Okay, well, I think that's about.
I think Peter Schiff said that it's going to cause hyperinflation, though.
Oh yeah, he's always saying that. Every time I see him, he's saying that. So I think that's a good round number of topics. I mean, I'm familiar with this, and I was almost overload. But before we leave, is there anything else that you want to add to what we've gone over today?
No, I think we covered it pretty good.
Awesome. Okay. Well, we will continue on a round 3. We'll put our goal is to make this more and more complex as we go along. Right now, it's in the phases of presenting you an idea that sounds crazy and backing it up with evidence and reason. And we're hoping to make kind of a, what do you want to call it, a MMT for conservatives
primer
crash course. So stay tuned, and we'll keep pumping them out. So thanks for coming on, Nima. I'm looking forward to the next one.
Thanks, Dylan.